I'm sharing this experience to encourage others to be more careful when being somewhere alone at night, especially at rest areas. This incident occurred not too long ago. This happened in North Carolina while I was traveling with my dad, who's a truck driver. I joined him for a few days on the road to gain some experience because I'm interested in getting my CDL in a few years. We're from Georgia, so the drive to North Carolina wasn't long, and we arrived basically the same day. The delivery was scheduled for early the next morning. Around 12 o'clock or 1 a.m., we stopped at a rest area for the night. The parking lot was full of trucks, but the restrooms were completely empty, likely because most drivers were asleep in preparation for early deliveries. As soon as we parked, my dad went straight to sleep. I'm usually a night owl, so I stayed awake. Around 2 a.m., I decided to use the restroom. I also brought my razor with me so I could line up my mustache, assuming no one would be inside at that hour and that I'd feel free and comfortable taking my time, since I usually only do that at home. When you enter the restroom, there's two sections, one on the left and one on the right. I went to the left side and noticed a man standing near the urinal. I didn't think much of it at first. I went into his stall, and after a few minutes, I came out to the sink to start training. While I was doing this, I noticed the same man was still standing in the same spot. He wasn't using the urinal. He was just standing there, facing the wall. It felt very off. I tried to ignore him and focused on what I was doing. Suddenly, I heard him whisper something, but I couldn't make out what it was. He had this very wide, unnatural smile. I quickly finished up, packed my things, and headed for the exit. As I was walking out, I looked back and saw him following me. I picked up my pace and made it back to the truck. I noticed a separate parking lot behind the rest area for passenger vehicles. One red car had its headlights on and was the only car illuminated. When I turned to look at it, the headlights immediately shut off. I couldn't see who was inside due to the darkness and distance. I don't know if the driver just got there and was parking, or possibly even the same man from earlier, but the timing unsettled me. I went back to the truck where my dad was still asleep. Nothing else happened that night. I returned to my normal life. However, I never told my dad about the incident because he's very strict and had only recently started letting me go outside alone. I was 17 at the time, and I knew telling him would likely result in him not letting me go outside alone again until I turned 18. The only person I told about this was my friend afterward. I tried to rationalize what happened. The man didn't appear homeless or on drugs, but the way he was acting was far from normal. He had clean clothes and a well-kept beard, so I doubt he was homeless. Still, what continues to bother me is what he was planning and why he acted the way he did. And what will creep me out forever about that night is what would have happened if I hadn't had my razor with me. Since that incident, I've become much more careful about my surroundings, even during the day, and I avoid going out alone late at night. The story I'm about to tell is truly one of the most terrifying things that has ever happened to me, and is a prime example of how a great night can quickly turn into a real-life nightmare. These events took place a couple of years ago when I was 19. Now I'm almost 26. However, I clearly remember all the details, and honestly, I still can't really explain what happened. For some context, I'm from a relatively large city in southern Europe. Wow. My neighborhood consists of small houses and some residential buildings. Nothing out of the ordinary. No sketchy places or abandoned houses. To be fair, it's quite boring from time to time. Plus, I know personally all of my neighbors, so I've always felt safe living there. Back in those days, my life pretty much consisted of going to my lectures at university, then going back home to study for my exams, getting some sleep, and doing the same thing for entire weeks. I didn't have much free time at all. One Friday, though, my parents decided to visit some relatives from a different city. They were going to arrive there in the afternoon, stay on Saturday, and come back sometime on Sunday. This meant one thing. I had the house for myself during the weekend. What could be better for a young guy like me? I was looking forward to some peace and quiet, maybe ordering some pizza and playing video games late into the night. However, things took a dark turn on the second night. I was sitting in my room when I heard a faint sound coming from outside. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the pavement. I went to the window and looked out, but I couldn't see anything. I tried to shrug it off, thinking it was just a neighbor. But then I heard a blood-curdling scream. It was a man, and he sounded like he was in absolute distress. I didn't know what games were being played here, but slowly the fear was turning into annoyance and anger. I peeked through the window of my bedroom, which is on the second floor facing the street, and everything seemed normal. I decided to stay awake and alert as long as possible, but I guess at some point around 4 a.m., I dozed off. Several hours later, I was woken up by the sounds of my family getting home. It was already around noon. I had slept throughout half of the day, basically, which is unusual for me. At first, they joked that I looked like I had just woken up and asked to help them with their bags from the car. I thought it was time for me to tell them about everything that happened those past 3 days. And as I expected, they got very upset and worried. But at the same time, they were glad I was okay. A week later, we decided to install cameras in front and in the back of the house. And nothing similar has happened again. I never got an update from the police either. To this day, I have no idea what could have caused those people to chase after me. Who was that screaming man, and why was he in such distress? One night in July, a friend and I were road tripping home from a long vacation. We'd been on the road for hours on end, and were growing very tired. We kept on pushing though, consuming supplements such as coffee and engaging in motivational conversation to pass the time. My friend's eyes were quickly sinking though. I saw signs in the distance for the next exit. We decided to veer off to an exit for Springfield, Ohio. Instantly, we began the search for a motel to rest at. Up ahead in the distance, we saw a sign for Night's Inn. If you've never been to a Night's Inn, it's a fairly cheap motel. Minimum breakfast, extremely shady rooms, and cheap prices for each night. But you really get what you pay for. My friend and I approached the front desk and requested a room. The owner seemed to hardly speak any English, but after dealing with a language barrier for about 10 minutes, everything seemed to be situated. We were set to stay in room 13. As we made our way to that room, we began to grow more and more tired. I slid the key into the door, and after a subtle click, the door unlocked. I pushed my way inside the room. As you might imagine, it was extremely underwhelming and had the faint smell of cigarettes and Cheetos. I kid you not, but a room is a room. So, after taking a shower, I climbed onto the twin-sized bed, and my friend did the same. Within 10 minutes or so, we both dozed off together. At 5 a.m. though, I was abruptly awoken by heavy banging on the door. I glanced over to my friend, who shot up just as quickly as I did, trembling in fear. After about 3 minutes of being frozen there, I silently crawled over to my phone, avoiding the main window as to not be seen. I dialed 911 and explained the situation. They claimed they were sending an officer right away. The banging was still going on, so I screamed the person outside. "What do you want?" Instantly, the banging stopped. I could hear muffled voices on the other side of the door. Then they began to fade away. At this point, it was around 5:30 a.m., still dark outside. I made my way over to the door and took a look out to the peephole. There was nothing there. As soon as I slipped back, though, a loud banging echoed throughout the room as someone began to pound on the window. A deep voice was heard laughing outside. It stopped soon after it began, and the cops never showed up. When daylight beamed through the window, we booked it over to the car and drove off. This, however, was not the most unsettling part. The next day, as soon as I got home, which was maybe another hour or so away, I began to watch the news. A 40-year-old man had been found at that night's inn. Room number 14, which was right next to the room we were staying in. He had many weapons with him and a 14-year-old girl who he claimed she was in love with him. To this day, I'm not sure exactly who was banging on my door that morning, but I have some suspicions and I'm thankful I decided not to answer it. I met my friend Nick in middle school. At the time, we weren't really friends, but I did get to know him a little bit. Frankly, he scared me. When I first met him, he was one of those kids who wore all black and gave himself piercings. He would do it during class, using safety pins. He was bipolar and had a slew of other issues as well, including being on drugs at the time. Fast forward a few years to high school, and I didn't really have any friends. I was kind of a loner. I have a fall birthday, so I was one of the first kids in my class to turn 16 and get my license and start driving myself to school. Nick had since grown out of the gothy. He got on medication for his psychological problems and now seemed like a fairly normal guy. One day, he was talking to me and asked me if I could give him a ride home. I was all too happy to help, considering at the time I was pretty desperate for someone to hang out with. I ended up becoming very good friends with him and another guy he hung out with as well. The three of us pretty much spent all of high school as a tight-knit group. Looking back, I think they kind of took advantage of me as my family had more money than either of theirs. I was happy to share though. I drove them to lunch and paid for it every time when they said they didn't have money. It would never be anything major, just a few bucks here and there. We did have some really good times too. They were pretty good guys for most of the time, but I do feel like that was at least part of the reason why they became my friends at all. Even if that was the case though, it was worth it for me because they were literally the only bright spot in my otherwise miserable high school experience. Nick could be in sometimes, especially if you spent more than a day or so with him at a time. I took a week Long Beach trip with his family and ended up spending more time with his brother than him because he drove me absolutely insane. There was even a particular incident at a go-kart track where he was literally screaming at a 10-year-old kid and trying to pick a fight with the kid's father after the race. Why, you ask? All because he cut him off on the track. Then he got pissed at me for not backing him up when I was too busy trying to crawl into a corner and pretend like I didn't know him. It was all just so ridiculous. I was embarrassed. Actually, friend or not, I was hoping the guy would kick his ass because he deserved it. After high school, Nick stayed in our hometown and went to local community college. Me and the other guy went to State University a few hours away. We actually were roommates. We would see Nick when we came home on the weekends. After that year, he joined us. Nick was really struggling though, and was in and out of school, never really trying that hard. At one point, his girlfriend from high school cheated on him, and he took it pretty hard. They started adjusting his medication. I don't think they ever got it quite right because he was never the same again. During this time, I introduced him to my girlfriend's sister. We actually had gone to school with her, but never really knew her until I started dating her sister. Anyway, they started dating as well. At first, it was cool because we could go on double dates and stuff. I was a little worried though, because I knew how he could be sometimes. I was afraid of what might happen if their relationship ever went south. Her parents really hated him. I was always trying to defend him best I could without making them hate me too. I'd since gotten engaged to my girlfriend, so I felt like I was always in the middle between my future in-laws and one of my best friends. Eventually, they got engaged too. Her parents really hated that they'd rushed into getting married. I think they'd been together less than a year at the time they moved in. Things quickly went south though. He started expecting her to support him. He quit going to school and said he was going to live on disability for the rest of his life because of all of his issues. They fought pretty much constantly, and they had only been married for about 4 to 5 months. Then he even started threatening to kill her. He even went as far as to detail the plans he had come up with to do it and get away with it. Needless to say, she left soon after, and they got divorced within less than a year. As you can imagine, this put me in quite the awkward spot of having to choose between my fiancée and her family, or one of my only friends. I try to defend him as best I could. You know, he's not really like that usually. His medication is messed up. He doesn't really mean it. He won't really do that. I mean, how truly can you stick up for someone who's threatening to remember his wife, though? I did the best I could, but ultimately, if I wanted to keep my fiancé, I had to lose that friend. Our other friend was supposed to have been my best man, but he refused after what happened with Nick. So I ended up losing both my friends over the ordeal, pretty much exactly what I'd been afraid of. The next time I spoke to Nick, he came into the store I was working at with some people I had never seen before. I said hey and gave him a friendly wave, but he immediately flipped me off and walked out. That was confirmation. Our friendship was completely over. I'm not really sure how any of that was my fault, but I guess I was supposed to leave my 6-year relationship and break things off with my lover because this guy was a psychopath and threatened to kill her sister. I really wish that was the end of the story, but it continued on. Her sister found someone new who was an amazing guy and one of my now closest friends. I have far more in common with him than any of my old friends. I graduated, got married, moved homes, and now started a family. My now wife's sister got remarried to the new guy, and they had a kid together who's now 3 years old. Everyone was happy, and we pretty much forgot about Nick. That was until the day he came back into town and started working at the local grocery store. My mother-in-law was the first to notice him and pretty much forbade her daughter from shopping there. She was terrified he would come after her or her kid if he saw them. They ended up moving away to the other side of town. I wasn't as threatened by him though, so I continued to shop there. I assumed, since it had been 5 years, he must have moved on with his life. I would see him working at the register or whatever. But other than that, I really didn't go out of my way to avoid him. One day, I saw him looking at me, though I didn't speak to him because of the way our last interaction was gone. I was met with the coldest stare I'd ever seen. After that, any time I was in the store, he would follow me around the entire time. When I left the store, he would head outside and pretend to bring carts in or something and watch me until I was in the car leaving. The last time I shopped there, I made the mistake of taking my newborn son with me. He started fussing. So, of course, I'd picked him up and tried to calm him down. At that point, Nick walked by and slammed into me, trying to make me drop my baby. Then he walked off like nothing had happened. I decided that day it would be best if I started shopping at Walmart instead. I realized that I'd forgotten to sit the trash out to be picked up. It was around 3 a.m. when I went back outside to move the cans to the curb. As I walked out of my garage, a large van with blacked out windows suddenly came down the street and stopped at the end of my driveway. I was nervous since it was 3 a.m. and it was clearly not my neighbor. I took my time fiddling with the cans beside the house, waiting to see what they were going to do. Eventually, they went down the street and stopped. I put the cans out as fast as I could and went back inside, making sure all the doors were locked. I went to sleep with my gun on the nightstand. Around this time, my grandmother's house was broken into two. Whoever did it knew where everything was in her house because they didn't rummage through. They just took all of her sentimental items, then went straight to the closet where my grandfather's guns were, and took several of them as well. About a week later, they returned, cleaned out everything they hadn't taken the first time. We had no proof, so the cops wouldn't do anything. But I'm fairly certain it was Nick. He had been to her house before, and I had shown him the guns when we were friends, since whoever it was broke in knowing exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it. That narrowed down the list of suspects. Since then, I've seen that van driving around in front of my house at all hours of the night. It's becoming less frequent since I started shopping elsewhere, and thankfully, nothing more serious has happened. I have to keep a gun nearby at night now, and I'm still hoping this doesn't escalate again. I live a little bit out in the country. It's a quiet area, and most people have a little bit more land. I remember that one Saturday, late afternoon, while I was driving home, I noticed a yard sale sign. A few years ago, I moved into this one neighborhood. I was living alone and renting a home because I worked in the area. I no longer live in that area, but I do remember the creepiest thing that happened when I did so. A few weeks after I moved into the house, one of the neighbors had a yard sale. How? The street that I lived on had quite a few houses on it, and I hadn't really met any of the neighbors yet. Nothing strange had happened at all up to that point. The yard sale was at the house directly across the street and one house to the left. I'm pretty sure it was a Friday or something. So I walked over from my house to where the yard sale was. There were a few other people there. The house belonged to this lady named Ruth. I talked to her for a short time while I was there. As I was in her front yard, looking through her things for sale though, I noticed the house next door. This would be the house directly across the street from mine. Just inside one of the windows, I could see a man looking out and staring at me. It was a little unnerving, so I looked away and continued to go through the various items for sale. A few minutes later, I glanced up and noticed the man was still at the window, staring at me. This was really strange. Soon enough, though, I picked out the things I wanted to buy and went up to Ruth. We talked briefly, and she was very nice. I told her about how I'd recently moved in, and then I left our yard and headed back over to my own house. While I was crossing the street, I couldn't help but notice the man still observing me. He was at another window now, though. I found his behavior really odd, to be sure, but I just went back home. After that, a few hours later, which was the early evening now, I noticed out of my front window that the man was now outside in his yard. He was just kind of wandering around randomly, and I noticed him looking at my place over and over. This was starting to seem really unnerving. I just tried to ignore it though. I didn't notice the guy for the rest of the day. That night though, I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning. The very first thing I heard was a knocking at my front door. I had no idea who it could be. When I got up and looked out of a window, I saw it was that neighbor from across the street, the same man who'd been staring at me all day. Obviously, I had no idea why he would be here at 2 a.m., and I was definitely not going to answer the door for him. I stayed near the front area of the house, though. The man knocked again and then finally walked away. I looked through the window and saw him go back inside his house. I was very creeped out by this whole series of events. The next day, the yard sale was still going on, so I walked over to Ruth and decided to ask her what she knew about the guy next door. She told me the guy had a criminal history and was a really sketchy guy and that I should try to avoid him. I then left and went back to my place. I was more worried now about why the guy had been over at 2 a.m. Over the next few days, I didn't really see him at all. I was just about ready to put it off as a one-off thing and not really think about it much anymore. That was until one night. There was another knocking at the door, very late. It woke me up once again, and I knew this had to be the same guy. I got up and looked out the window, and there he was standing right outside the front door. Knocked another time, and obviously, I did not answer. I made sure he couldn't see me. I hoped he would just walk away again like before. This time, though, he did not. He stayed by the door for a while. He turned around, and I thought he would walk away. But instead, he turned to the left and walked toward one of my windows. I moved out of the way. He pressed his face up against it and tried looking inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police. The man stayed at my window for a short time before slipping around the side of my home. I could no longer see him, and I just hoped he wouldn't break in. I didn't hear or see anything until the police got there. Though when the police arrived, they found the man walking around in my next door neighbor's backyard. He claimed he simply had the wrong address and was going to a friend's house. Obviously, that didn't make any sense because he literally lived right across the street. He went back to his house, and I was nervous. Something like that would happen again. But thankfully, it did not. That's really because the guy only lived in that home for another month and then moved somewhere. Where or why he moved, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm just glad I didn't have to interact with that man anymore. I don't know what his plans were for me. This happened to me almost 3 years ago, almost to the day, while I was in Idaho serving a full-time mission. Town that me and my companion, who I'll refer to as Spencer, were assigned to, was quite small, so there wasn't always a lot for us to do. And on top of this, at the time, I was going through a rough patch, things like self-esteem issues and having trouble sleeping. So, as a result, we found it difficult to stay out all day doing work. Well, one other thing about where we were assigned was that we were living in an actual house, albeit a tiny one. Usually we only ever get apartments, but I guess for this area, a house was the only option, probably because there were no apartments anywhere nearby. The layout of the house was fairly simple. As you walk through the front door, you enter the main room where our desks were, and immediately to your right was our bedroom. If you kept walking straight, you would walk through a large open doorway that led right into the kitchen. From there, to your right was the bathroom, and to your left was the laundry room. And that was it. besides one storage closet in the kitchen as well. One other detail was that although the house technically stood on its own lot, the landlord's house was right next door. And anytime we had problems with something, we could just walk over or call him. On this particular night, I was sitting in the living room at my desk on my phone, with my chair turned to face the kitchen, and Spencer was sitting in the bedroom on his phone. It had gotten dark outside a couple of hours earlier, so we returned home and were just relaxing before we went to bed. In the middle of whatever I was doing, I heard a single knock come from the window above the sink, and because of the layout of the house where this window was, you could basically see the whole living area where I was sitting. I looked up at the window for a few seconds, but only saw darkness. I went back to what I was doing and began to think that it must have just been a branch or something. There were large trees behind the house, but the more I thought about it, the more unlikely it seemed. None of the trees were close enough to the house to brush the window that way, and it wouldn't have made a knock sound like the one I heard. In the middle of having this thought, I heard another knock around the corner at the window in the laundry room. The full weight of what was happening was finally coming into focus, but my mind was still looking for an explanation that didn't conclude that someone was outside circling the house, stalking my companion and I. I started to tell Spencer what I had heard from the living room, but as I was, another knock came from the window in the living room, the one right next to me. I didn't see who it was on the other side, and I didn't want to. I jumped up and ran into the bedroom and locked the door. I asked Spencer if he heard it too, and he said, yes. We started debating what to do. All we had for weapons were a couple of knives, and we didn't know how many people were actually out there or if they were armed, so going to confront them on our own was out of the question. During our discussion, the knocking sound moved from the window in the living room to the front door itself, and we were getting more and more freaked out. We briefly debated calling the police, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and it would take them forever to get out there to help us. Then Spencer remembered we had the landlord's number. He called him and began explaining the situation, and by this point, we hadn't heard a knock at the door for a couple of minutes or so, but I knew what that meant, and I was dreading it when it finally came. A knock at our bedroom window. The blinds were closed, so we couldn't see who it was, and they couldn't see us, but that did make me feel much better. Spencer told him someone was stalking the house, and he said he would be right out with a shotgun. We waited for another few minutes, anticipating another knock. But nothing happened until finally our landlord came to the door and announced himself. We asked him if he had seen anyone, and he said no, but that he saw a pickup truck speeding away as he approached the house. I asked if he had gotten a license plate or any other features that could help the police, but he said they had already been too far away for him to see anything. Spencer and I grabbed our flashlights and circled the house with him. There were small patches of snow on the ground from a weather system that had come through a few days earlier, and in the snow we saw footprints indeed circling the house. And as far as we could tell, there was only one set. We debated calling the police, but we knew that they wouldn't be much help in tracking the guy down. The landlord said to call him again if the guy came back, and with that, we went back into the house, locked everything down, and tried to sleep, but we couldn't. The first thing that came to mind was other missionaries playing a prank on us. But if that was the case, why didn't they reveal themselves or say, "Gotcha," or something like that at some point? Also, it was past curfew. Everyone was supposed to be home and the closest missionaries to us were at least 20 minutes away. The other possibility was that it was some teenagers from the ward playing a prank, but that didn't seem likely either, especially afterwards, because again, they would have come back and started laughing at us. There was only one set of footprints we found. If it was a prank, I feel like that would have been a group thing to do. After the fact, no one ever fessed up when we did some asking around, so to this day we still have no idea who was outside or why they chose to harass us. But the scariest thing to me wasn't the knocking or how the only thing separating us from him was a thin layer of glass, but the fact that I likely looked right at this guy when he first knocked on the window in the kitchen and didn't even know it. From that day forward, my sleep only got worse. Nothing worked. And my own personal issues did not improve either. I'm not sure I'll ever go back to that house. I was living alone in a small rental house just outside town when this happened. It was a one-story place at the end of a short, dead-end road. There were only 5 houses on the street, and at night it was usually quiet. I work from home doing freelance graphic design, so most days I didn't leave unless I had to get groceries. I didn't get visitors often. My friends usually texted before coming over. That's why the first knock stood out. It was around 8:45 at night on a Thursday. I was in the living room watching TV when I heard 4 firm knocks on the front door. I muted the TV and waited, thinking maybe I imagined it. Then there were 2 more knocks. I got up and walked to the door. There's a small peephole in the center of it. When I looked through, I saw a man standing on my porch holding a medium-sized cardboard box. He looked normal, maybe mid-30s. I opened the door, but kept the chain on. He immediately said that he had a delivery that required a signature. He read a name off a small handheld device. It wasn't my name. It wasn't even close. I told him he had the wrong address. He looked down at the box, then at the device, then back at me. He read the address out loud. It was my exact address. I told him no one by that name lived here. He stared at me for a second longer than necessary. Then he said he must have been given the wrong information and would take it back to the truck. I watched him walk back down my driveway. I expected to see a delivery van or at least a car parked somewhere nearby, but there was nothing. He walked past my mailbox and turned the corner at the end of the street. I didn't see where he went. I shut the door and locked it. I told myself it was just a small company delivery or maybe a contractor driver without a marked vehicle. The next night, at almost the exact same time, there were 3 knocks again. This time, I didn't open the door right away. I went to the peephole first. It was the same man with the same jacket and box. I didn't open the door. I just spoke through it and told him he already came by and that no one with that name lived here. He didn't answer right away. Then he said he just needed a signature and that the system showed the package had to be delivered tonight. I told him I wasn't signing for someone I didn't know. There was a long pause. Then he said, okay, and stepped back from the door. I stayed at the peephole. Instead of walking away right away, he stood at the edge of the porch looking at the house. He slowly turned his head toward my front windows, then toward the side of the house, then back at the door. After about 15 seconds, he finally walked down the driveway. Again, I saw no vehicle. That's when it started to feel wrong. On the 3rd night, there was no knock. I thought maybe he figured out the mistake. I even joked to myself about how weird it would have been if he showed up again. On the 4th night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes around 9 p.m. when I heard 4 knocks. It wasn't on the front door. It was on the side of the house near the dining room window. I slowly walked into the dining room and looked toward the window, but no one was there. Then there were 4 more knocks at the front door. I went to the peephole, and it was him again. But this time, he wasn't holding a box. His hands were empty. I didn't say anything, and he knocked again. Then he stepped back and looked directly at the peephole. I stepped away from the door so he couldn't see movement, and I didn't make a sound. After about 30 seconds, he turned and walked away. I waited 5 full minutes before checking the windows. I saw him standing across the street near the tree line. He was just standing there, facing my house. After maybe a minute, he walked off into the darkness. I relocked every window and door again, even though they were already locked. The next day, I called the local police non-emergency line and explained what had been happening. The officer I spoke to said it sounded like someone trying to verify occupancy. He said sometimes burglars will knock to see if someone answers before trying to break in later. He told me to install cameras if I could and to call 911 if the man came back. That night, I left all the lights off in the front of the house and stayed in my bedroom. Around 8:45, right on time, there were 4 knocks. I didn't respond at all. After a few seconds, 4 more. Then silence. I waited about a minute, then I heard something else. A soft thud against the back of my house, and then another. I grabbed my phone and quietly walked into the hallway. I could hear the back door knob turning slowly, and then stopping, and then turning again. I called 911 like I was instructed, and whispered that someone was trying to get into my house. While I was on the phone, the knocking started again at the front door. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way. The back doorknob kept turning. Then I heard the sound of something metal scraping lightly against the door frame. After about 30 seconds, everything stopped. Even as it was totally silent, though I stayed on the phone until the police arrived. When they searched the outside of the house, they found fresh pry marks on the back door near the handle. The officer told me if I hadn't been home, the door likely would have been forced open. They drove around but didn't find anyone suspicious. The next night, I stayed at my brother's apartment across town. I didn't tell anyone on social media or anything that I wasn't home. I just left. Around 9 p.m., my phone rang. It was my neighbor from 2 houses down. She said there was someone standing on my porch, knocking repeatedly. She said he had been there for at least 5 minutes. She asked if I was home. I told her no and asked if he had a vehicle. She said she didn't see one. I told her to call the police. Officers arrived and questioned him. Later that night, an officer called me and said the man claimed he was trying to deliver a package, but he misplaced it. He had no company ID and no marked vehicle. They warned him to stay away from the property. 2 days later, police arrested him in a nearby neighborhood after he was caught attempting to break into a house where the owner was out of town. In his car, they found multiple empty cardboard boxes and a small handheld scanner that wasn't connected to any real delivery company. During questioning, he admitted he would knock with a fake package first. If someone answered, he would leave and mark the house as occupied. If no one answered after multiple attempts, he would come back later and force entry. He told detectives that sometimes he would knock several nights in a row to see if the pattern changed. If lights were on one night and off the next, he assumed the house was empty. Hearing that made me realize how close I was to not being home that first week. If I'd ignored the door on one of those early nights, he probably would have come back later, expecting no one inside. I moved out of that house 3 months later, when my lease ended. I still don't answer the door at night unless I know exactly who's coming over. If someone knocks unexpectedly, I stay quiet and check cameras first. And if anyone ever shows up with a package that has my address, but not my name, I don't even go near the door anymore. This story starts in the lead up to Christmas. To set the scene, I live near Glasgow in Scotland. I stay with my parents, siblings, cats, and dogs. We're a close-knit family and often spend nights together in the living room watching TV, playing games, and catching up on our lives. At the time of this story, I was 16, turning 17. I was in high school, but getting closer to leaving and starting my education outside of it. In the days leading up to Christmas, during one of those late nights together, we were watching A Christmas Carol. We often have movie nights around Christmas, and it's one of my favorite things about that time of year. During the movie, we had a knock at the door. This wasn't unusual, so we didn't think much of it. My mum got up to answer it, but nobody was there. The street was empty. Our garden wrapped from the front of the house around to the back, so she checked along the side of the house too, but there was nobody there either. She came back inside and we resumed the movie. A few days later, I was sitting at the living room table doing exam work when I heard another knock. I paused my work and went to answer the door, but again, nobody was there. We assumed it was probably neighborhood kids playing a prank. Where I'm from, kids sometimes get bored and cause trouble instead of finding something better to do. In Scotland, there's a game called Chappie, where kids knock on someone's door and run away laughing. It's stupid, but as a kid, the adrenaline rush of someone opening the door to nobody there can be weirdly fun. We have a family group chat where we keep each other updated on things, and throughout that week, several family members mentioned experiencing the same thing. The one that stood out the most was something my dad experienced. At the time, my dad usually stayed up later than everyone else, either playing Xbox or watching shows once the house was quiet. One night around 11:30, when the street was silent and all the kids would have been inside, he heard a very quiet knock. He was confused because of the time. He checked through the peephole before opening the door, but he saw nobody. He slowly unlocked and opened the door to look outside. Again, nobody was there. He locked the door and came upstairs to ask if anyone had heard it. But because the knock was so quiet, nobody else had. This started to unsettle us because it had been happening repeatedly. Nobody had ever seen or heard anyone outside except for the knocking itself. Usually, when kids do this, you hear them laughing or running away. This felt different. Christmas Day is when everything escalated. We spent the day with family, opening presents, sharing gifts, watching movies, playing games, and eating way too much food. It was a great day. Later that night, I felt sick from eating so much, which I always do Christmas, so I went upstairs to lie down. I ended up dozing off and woke up hours later. When I checked my phone, it said 2:01 a.m. Everyone else was in bed, and the house was completely silent. I knew I wouldn't be able to fall back asleep because once I woke up, it's hard for me to sleep again no matter what time it is. I stayed on my phone in the dark, scrolling social media instead of turning the TV on, watching Christmas present haul videos, and messaging friends who were still awake. It's normal during Christmas break when there's no school or responsibilities, and you try to enjoy the freedom before going back to exams and routines. After a while, I heard a faint knock. I wasn't sure if it came from my door, my window, or if I imagined it. I sat up straight in bed, staring into the dark room with my heart racing. I didn't want to move. I knew nobody should be outside at that time on Christmas night. I didn't know if the past few weeks were just getting into my head or if someone was actually inside the house. My room is on the second floor, so someone being at my window would be very unlikely. After what felt like forever, I finally worked up the courage to open my bedroom door. As I did, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming up the stairs. My brain immediately assumed it was my dad coming up to bed after staying up late like he usually did. I stepped into view of the staircase to tell him I was still awake and heard the knocking again. That's when I realized it wasn't my dad. It was a man I'd never seen before. I immediately felt sick when I saw him. I wondered if this was the person behind all the knocking. He was already inside the house. He was staggering as he climbed the stairs and looked heavily intoxicated. I slowly backed into my room, luckily without him seeing me, and I quietly shut my door. I could hear him walking around and opening doors going into each room one by one. I remember thinking it was only a matter of time before he reached mine. I completely froze and didn't know what to do. It felt like all my common sense disappeared. Eventually, I opened my door slightly and saw him coming out of my younger sister's room. That's when my brain finally kicked back into action. I ran to my parents' room and woke them up, telling them there was a man inside the house. My mum woke up instantly while my dad was still groggy. We went downstairs together and found the man passed out on the couch, with my dad's beers opened and scattered around him. My mom shouted at him to get out. He woke slightly and angrily insisted the house belonged to him. We tried to get him up, but he was completely dead weight. My mom slapped him trying to wake him, but he barely reacted. A few minutes later, my dad came fully downstairs, saw what was happening, and immediately took control of the situation. He shouted at the man that this was not his house and threatened him to leave. The man refused. My dad eventually had to physically lift him off the couch and drag him out the side door. He forced him outside and warned him not to come back before shutting the door. We thought it was finally over, but seconds later, glass suddenly shattered toward us. The man had punched through the window, sending broken glass inside, pushed his face inside the broken glass like something out of The Shining while my dad went to call the police. The man started shouting aggressive threats, saying he now owned the house, that he knew what we looked like, and that he would return. Needless to say, we were all in shock. It was hard to believe someone would do something like this on Christmas night. Eventually he left, and the police arrived. They took statements from all of us. Mine was the longest since I had seen him first that night, which is actually rare where we live, since we usually just get slush. There was a clear trail of blood leading down the street. Police followed it to a nearby playground where they found the man lying on the ground with blood and glass in his hands. They arrested him after and later confirmed they believed he was the intruder. Our window was replaced the next morning. We told my siblings what had happened. Surprisingly, they slept through the whole thing, probably knocked out from all the Christmas food. Later, I got a restraining order against the man because of my age and the threats he made. He was fined for the damage and given community service instead of jail time when police questioned him about the weeks of knocking at our door before the incident. He claimed he knew nothing about that and denied ever doing it. Turned out he actually lived in our house years before we moved in. He claimed there was no bad intention and said he had simply drank too much while out with friends and accidentally went into the wrong house. Thankfully, nobody in our family was seriously hurt. The only injury was my mom bruising her wrist from slapping him while wearing bracelets. Apparently, that hurts you more than the person you hit. To this day, we still have no explanation for the knocking that happened before that night. Even now, sometimes I feel like I hear a knock late at night. Maybe it's just in my head, or maybe it isn't. I guess I'll never know if it was him or someone else out there watching. This happened around 2010 when I was about 6 years old. My family and I were living in a small neighborhood in Springfield, Oregon. It was my older brother, sister, my mom and I, as my dad was deployed at the time. I was really close with my dad and always took it hard when he was away. Late one night, I sat on the porch with my mom while she smoked a cigarette. We watched the rain. While we were sitting there, we noticed a man walking in the middle of the road. He was wearing one of those oversized yellow rain jackets. It immediately caught both of our attention because it was pouring rain really late and there was no one else usually out at that hour. We sat there watching him as he began walking slightly toward our driveway. My mom stood up, grabbed my hand, put her cigarette out, and we watched as the man stopped walking right next to our garbage cans in our driveway. My mom turned to take us inside, and the man began yelling at us. I don't remember what he said, but I remember being so terrified as my mom rushed me inside. As soon as we got inside, my mom locked the door and turned off all the lights. At that point, I was terrified, and of course, being a kid, I started crying. My mom rushed my siblings and I, shushing us, and we all went and laid in my parents' king-size bed together, as we were all a bit worried. But nothing else happened. There was no more yelling or noise or anything. So we all drifted to sleep. That night, I had a terrible nightmare. I can still picture it to this day. It was of a man in a big yellow rain jacket peering through our window. I woke up terrified and crying, literally shaking my sister awake, just so I could tell her I was scared. I have no idea how much time passed. My sister got out of bed and walked me to the bathroom that was attached to the bedroom. She shut the door and spoke with me while I cried, trying not to wake my mom or brother. But while we were in there, we suddenly heard banging, loud banging on the front door. My sister burst out of the bathroom and started shaking my mom awake without saying anything. And naturally, my brother woke up from the sound too. I sat terrified in the bathroom while my mom motioned for my siblings to join me in there. We watched her walk out of the room toward the front door. My siblings and I were all crying, scared out of our minds, as this man was still repeatedly banging on the door. My mum must have been trying to find her old BlackBerry phone, but seemingly failed because when she came back, she didn't have it. That meant none of us could call the police since this was the only phone in the house. We sat there in silence, listening to the man, who was now screaming and yelling for us to let him in while still banging loudly on the door. It was honestly a really hopeless and fearful night. It was just the five of us, with no phone to call the police, and my dad, who was normally our protector, was gone. We sat there on the floor, huddled together, freaking out and praying our neighbors would call the police. But nothing happened. Eventually, the man left, but no police ever came. What was strange is that it was a small neighborhood where everyone lived close together, and our house specifically was a duplex. So, how not a single neighbor heard this and called the police is beyond me. Eventually we went to sleep and everything was okay for a while, but not even a few weeks later, still. Just the five of us at my home, my family, woke up to my front door wide open, along with a window open and a huge hole cut into the window screen. My mom immediately called the police. There were lots of random items missing, including my piggy bank filled with all my holiday savings, along with random items around the house. But the most disturbing thing missing was a giant vase filled with cash and coins that my family had been saving for months. The sickening part was that it had been on my nightstand right next to my bed where we were all sleeping. This was a long time ago, and sadly, my mom has since passed and my dad wasn't there when it happened, so I'm not really sure what other details I might have missed. I do know that the intruder was never caught. I also don't know if the same man who was harassing us that night was the same person who broke into our house weeks later. It could be connected or it could not be. I do know that none of us were harmed, which makes me feel like maybe it wasn't the same person, because that man seemed really aggressive for someone who just wanted money. But on the other hand, I later found what looked like the same giant vase sitting on the porch of a neighbor who was a man that lived alone and that we never really saw. So honestly, who knows? When this happened, I was about 12 or 13. I was staying the night at my friend Rose's house, and her mom left us to care for her little sister while she went out for a few hours. Being the good babysitters that we were, we decided to head over to a local park that had a playground just to hang out for a while and let her little sister play around. We had been there for about 30 minutes and were just hanging out, pushing her little sis on the swings, when two guys showed up out of nowhere. They sat down at a picnic table close to the playground. The first guy looked to be in his teens, probably around 5'10", short dark brown hair, brown eyes, and a medium build. The other guy, though, had to have been in his early 30s. He was very large, about 6'1" and 250 pounds. He had this giant beard and shoulder-length curly hair with green eyes. We noticed them when they sat down, but didn't really give them a second thought. Apart from their age and unusual physical appearance for this area, there was really nothing that stood out about them. It was until the older guy, whose name was apparently Chris, decided to start up a conversation with us. At first, he asked us our names and they gave us theirs as well. Then they asked what we were up to today, still being fairly polite. As a kid, I was raised to be very respectful of my elders. So I answered him but kept my answer short. I continued to play with Rose and her sister, and he kept asking us questions. Where were we headed later? Did we want to hang out with him and his nephew instead? Who was the younger guy apparently? A guy whose name I can't remember. All of this while getting closer and closer to us. We told them we were going home after Rose's sister was done playing and that we weren't allowed to go anywhere else. He then offered some beer that he had with him and asked me if I smoked. I'd never drunk any alcohol up to that point, and I wasn't about to start that night. I declined his offer. He then started talking about how pretty I was and asked if I had a boyfriend. Without skipping a beat, he told me he'd recently gotten out of jail and was looking for a young girlfriend. I told him I didn't have one, but that I wasn't interested in having one like him either. During this whole interaction, he would occasionally address his attention to his nephew. From the interactions they were having, I quickly caught on they were in some sort gang. That's when I started to get a bit nervous. Even I knew you didn't mess with the people in the local gang. I knew we had to be careful about what we said next. He was quiet after that, and I figured they were going to move on and bug someone else. I was wrong though. He asked me if I wanted to hang out with them again. I told him again we couldn't do so, and we had to watch Rose's little sister. He went quiet again. No, we should have just picked up and left right then, but I had just started getting into my rebellious stage and thought we could handle these guys. No problem. Surely, they weren't really a threat. We weren't ready to go back to Rose's house just yet. We sat at another picnic table, thinking that if we ignored them, they would get the hint and go away. Of course not, though. Not 1 minute later, Chris and his nephew came and sat down right next to us. His nephew stayed at one end of our table. Chris came and sat right next to me. He started talking to me again about how pretty I was and how he could be my boyfriend. We should go hang out at his place, or I wanted to go at this point. His nephew actually started looking kind of nervous. He started chatting with Rosa. I could tell though, he realized just how young we really were and that his uncle was really about to cross the line. He told his uncle he thought they should go do something else because Rosa and I weren't allowed to do the stuff they wanted. Chris wasn't having any of that though. I don't remember what he said next. He was sitting next to me. The next thing I know, though he put his arms around my shoulders and pulled me into his side. I was completely caught off guard and didn't even know how to react. I'd never had an older guy that close to me, let alone touching me like that. I know I should have at least pushed him away or done something, but I froze. He kept saying again and again how he would be my boyfriend and take care of me from then on, asking me to go somewhere with him. I started slowly trying to get out from under his arm without trying to make a big deal out of it. At this moment, I was getting really scared. He was getting pushy, and I didn't want to piss him off, as it was just us in the park. I couldn't see or hear anyone else around. He then pulled me closer to him, and this time he kissed me. It wasn't just a quick little pick on the cheek either. It was a forceful, lingering kiss that completely threw me off. My mind started racing. I couldn't believe what just happened. Even Rose was sitting there with a complete look of shock on her face. At this moment, I was getting really scared. He was getting pushy, and I didn't want to piss him off, as it was just us in the park. I couldn't see or hear anyone else around. He then pulled me closer to him, and this time he kissed me. It wasn't just a quick little pick on the cheek either. It was a forceful, lingering kiss that completely threw me off. My mind started racing. I couldn't believe what just happened. Even Rose was sitting there with a complete look of shock on her face. I decided I'd had enough of this, and we had to get out of there. I pulled away one last time. It was now very obvious what he had on his mind. I told him it was getting late, and we had to get home as her mom was expecting us soon. He didn't seem very happy hearing that. I told him maybe after we could come back and hang out with him a bit more. It was obvious he didn't want to let me go, but we promised we would come back after. Finally, I guess he either believed me or decided to just let me go. I grabbed Rosa's little sister to carry her home. I had turned around and was getting ready to tell Rosa we had to leave. Suddenly, he seemed to have changed his mind. He rushed over to me and grabbed me from behind. He pulled me into him kind of like a bear hug with his whole body pressed up against mine. A flood of emotions ran through me at that moment. Fear, confusion, and still a bit of denial he would really do something to hurt me. I knew that was wrong either way. I needed to get away from this guy. I was kind of in a state of shock, but I knew I had to keep my wits about me. I decided to play along and tried to work out a way for him to let us leave without making him mad or think I was lying to him. I told him that if we weren't back on time, Rosa's mom would come out looking for us personally. I promised him we would just drop her sister off and come back right away. He let me go, but he didn't seem convinced. I told him as convincingly as I could that we had to take her little sister home and to just wait there for us. He seemed to have bought it. We quickly started walking back to Rosa's house, while he and his nephew sat at the table. As I glanced back, I saw his nephew trying to get him to leave again. I thought, great, they're leaving now. There's no way they're going to see where we're going or follow us. Wrong. Just as I thought they were going to leave in the opposite direction, the guy decided to follow us. We had a bit of a head start, but he was a really big guy and was gaining on us quickly. We hurried as fast as we could. We didn't want him to see where she lived. Once we got to our street, we took off running. We finally got back to Rosa's apartment and thought we were in the clear. I could hear Chris calling out my name outside, but I couldn't see him. We got inside as quickly and quietly as we could. Once inside, we went over to the window. I could still hear him calling out my name and getting really close as well. We decided to stay quiet and carefully watch from the window to see if they had seen where we'd gone. Luckily, they walked right past our apartment. We both breathed a huge sigh of relief, then started freaking out. Neither of us had ever experienced anything like that before. We were just glad it was over now. We were in the clear. Shortly after that, Rose's mom got home. Neither of us had any intentions of telling her what had happened that night, as Rose's mom was not exactly the nicest. We were sure we would get into a lot of trouble, even though we didn't really do anything wrong. We went back upstairs and were just chatting with Rose's mom and her younger brother. Then we heard a knock at the door. My heart stopped as I swore I could hear Chris's voice on the other side. We went back into the kitchen as Rose's mom went to answer the door. It was Chris and his nephew again. Somehow, they must have seen us. They asked Rose's mom if we were there. But luckily, we had been smart enough to give them fake names. And even then, Rose's mom was clearly having none of this. She told them to get the hell out of here and slammed the door in their face. Of course, she knew something was up and asked us if we knew them. We weren't about to admit that we did, though. We just told her we had no idea what was going on or who they were. I don't think she really bought it, but she left it at that. She told us not to answer the door. Later that evening, her mom had to go out again. So it was just Rose and I in the apartment now. Then we heard two voices that sounded very familiar just outside the window. I was terrified to even move. Then came a knock at the door. There was no way we were going to answer it now. We kept as quiet as possible and prayed they would just go away. They called out our names and tried knocking again. One of them even tried turning the doorknob. Thankfully, Rose's mom had locked it on her way out. They tried knocking one more time. We never saw either of them again. And we didn't go back to that park again for quite some time. It was a surreal experience. However, I will never forget the feel of his body against mine or how he reeked of cigarettes and beer. I own a home and I live by myself. I have not lived here for really that long, maybe 6 months or so. This is something that just happened a few weeks ago. Now, for some background, I've always considered the neighborhood to be very average. It's not a wealthy area, but it's also not known to be a bad neighborhood. Most of the people I've met have been very nice. Of course, I didn't meet all of my neighbors, just a few. In the entire 6 months or so that I lived there, though, everything in my house has been fine. That is, except for one night a couple of weeks ago. Like I mentioned, something very strange happened to me. I was in my living room sitting on my couch late one night. I think it was about 11 p.m. or so. All of a sudden, my doorbell rang 3 or 4 times in a row. I didn't know why somebody would be at my house this late. I got up from the couch and walked over to the door. When I looked out the window, though, it didn't appear that anybody was there. I even opened up the door and went out onto the front step. I looked all around, but I didn't see anybody. Then I went back inside my house. Just a minute later, there was another knock on the front door. It was extremely loud. I went over to the door again, but once more, whoever was doing this knocking had disappeared. I figured it was probably just some neighborhood kids doing some ding-dong ditching. I thought they probably wouldn't bother coming back. I waited around the front door for a little while. After a few minutes, nobody seemed to have come back. So I returned to the living room. Maybe 10 minutes later, though, there was a loud banging on the front door again. This time, I also heard them knocking on the front window as well. I ran from the living room as fast as I could to get to the front door area, but when I arrived, the people had stopped. I was just able to see them running away, though. Instead of kids, what I saw appeared to be 3 fully grown men running from the end of my driveway out into the street. I'd figured it had to be teenagers, but these guys looked much older. Maybe it was still just a harmless prank, but the fact that one of them was banging on the front window next to the door this time was a little bit unnerving. Another 10 minutes went by with nothing happening. I returned to the other room, now on edge. Some time went by, and I actually thought they must have been gone for good. Now, by this time, it was getting very late. They came back again, and this time was the worst by far. I heard a really loud bang at the front door. I started going over again, but as I was doing so, I suddenly heard the sound of glass shattering. When I arrived near the front door, there was glass all over the ground. This made me so angry. I ran over to the door and actually stepped outside. I saw the same 3 men running away into the street. I ran through my front yard and into the street after them. They were pretty far ahead of me, but I saw them go into a house that was at the end of the street. After they all went inside, I kept going down until I got to that house. This was not a silly joke anymore, but now a property crime. Their house was the worst looking one on the entire street. I walked up to the front door and knocked on it, but nobody answered. I continued to knock on their door. I wasn't going to go away. After I had been knocking for a few minutes, I heard somebody yell from inside for me to leave. I yelled back, but they broke my window. There was a few minutes of nothing, but then I heard somebody coming from behind the house. There was a person out in the yard. I couldn't see much because they had no porch light or any light at all, really. Moments after hearing whoever this was get to the side of the house, I looked over and heard something whiz past my head and hit a bush nearby. They chucked a rock at me. Another one nearly hit me right in the face. Instead, it hit the side of the house. When I was sprinting off the property, I heard at least 2 people laughing, which made me really angry. Still, it was a dangerous situation, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I got back to my house. Once I was there, I called the police. They came a short time later, and after showing them my window and telling them what happened, they went over to that house. Apparently, about 5 adults lived there, and most of them were addicts. So, when the cops showed up at the front door, they really panicked. One guy tried to run away. The police ended up going inside and finding all the contraband, and all of them were arrested. I pressed charges against them both for throwing rocks at me and breaking my window. Shortly after that, the house was sold to new owners who turned the place around. Because of that, I was very curious and decided to drive over and see what items would be for sale. It was a little bit later, so I wasn't sure if it was still going on or not. But the signs were still up, so why not try and see? I followed them, which led me to a street that was only about a minute away from my home. I'd never been down this one before. It was a very quiet street, surrounded on all sides by woods. I live a little bit out in the country. It's a quiet area, and most people have a little bit more land. I remember that one Saturday, late afternoon, while I was driving home, I noticed a yard sale sign. It was very unusual to see this sort of thing in my neighborhood. In fact, this was probably the first one I was aware of since living in the area. Kai, the second to last house before the end of this dead-end street, was where the sale was. The house had a large front yard. There also was a very long and narrow driveway to the left of the house. After the driveway, there was this little open area of grass, and then there was a dense woods beyond that. There appeared to be items spread out for sale in the grass between the driveway and the woods, but I didn't notice anybody there. And there were no other cars parked on the side of the street or anything. Still, I thought I should check it out. I parked my car, got out, and started walking onto the property. When I got past the driveway to the grassy area, I saw many items lying on the grass there. There was a lot of smaller furniture, lamps, mirrors, nightstands, many other random things as well. I looked all around, but I didn't see anybody at all. I wondered where the owner was. Had they gone inside and ended the sale or something? I thought about just leaving. It was about that time when I remember that I heard a noise coming from the woods behind me. It was clearly a person. The noise didn't really seem like one that would come from an animal. I looked over and thought I could see a man moving from behind some trees to another set in the woods. They were quite dense, so I didn't see his features very well at all. But there was clearly someone hiding out in the woods. Was this the owner of the sale? I couldn't help but feel creeped out. Why would they be in the woods hiding? After not hearing any noises for a few moments, I began to back away. Didn't seem like a place I should be anymore. I started walking to the driveway to go back down it. When I made it about halfway, heard some more noises from the woods behind me. I looked over my shoulder and saw a man emerge from them. He was looking at me and began to walk in my direction. At first, I kept going, but when I made it the very end of the driveway, I turned around and stopped. The man was looking at me with this dead expression on his face, just charging toward me. I asked him if this was his yard sale, and when I did, the man didn't say anything at all. He kept on stomping toward me. It was really weird. At that point, I ran to my car, parked on the other side of the street. I got to it and got inside. When I did, the man had now made it out to the street area. I quickly drove away and went home. The whole thing seemed kind of odd to me. Just a few days later, I read up on Facebook that a man had been caught in connection to and in the area. When I read the story, I found out that he'd argued with the homeowner having a yard sale. I guess he was trying to rob him, and the man having the sale didn't want to give him anything. So the man attacked the owner and started to beat him. The owner of the sale was able to get away into the woods and escaped onto a neighbor's property. When I realized this, I also realized that I must have had the very lucky fortune to have gotten there just a short time after that incident happened. I feel lucky the man didn't me too. I also realized that I must have had the very lucky and fortune to have gotten there just a short time after that incident happened. I feel lucky the man didn't attack me too.